Hello, greetings once again. Greetings from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. This is going to be the lecture which should be meant to correspond with Wednesday's class. Today is Sunday, October the 3rd, I believe, October the 4th, which means Wednesday will be October the 7th. So if you're wondering when you should be viewing this, relative to what, this will be Wednesday's lecture, relative to Monday, I suppose. Now, there are a few things I want to talk about before I get into the substance of what I'm going to be addressing with respect to the slides. I finished grading your guys' tests on Thursday of last week. So today is Sunday, okay? Today is Sunday, the 4th of October. Not incidentally, the day after, I believe this was either late Friday night or early sometime yesterday, Saturday morning, this became news that was disseminated. The day after, the governor, our esteemed governor here in Michigan, decided that the situation, epidemiologically speaking, in the Upper Peninsula was so bad and had deteriorated so substantially that the classification of that particular area was going to regress back to what she refers to as stage 4 of the pandemic response plan, which means well, there are a few implications that has, and I'm not sure whether or not they're going to play out, but for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, and you should be, because it may very well dictate how we proceed henceforth. Now, if you look at the language that's used in the executive order and in the various classification schema that has been promulgated by the state, you'll see that if you are in stage 4 of the pandemic response protocol, that places certain constraints and limitations on what people can and cannot do. And one of those limitations is that you are limited if, in fact, you work at a job and you do a particular job function that can conceivably be done remotely, then you must therefore do that job remotely. Now, I read that language as implying that that will take effect for those of us in education, because this certainly is something that does, in fact, lend itself to remote access and a remote means of conveyance. We'll see what that entails for Michigan Tech and Finlandia and Gogabek, but I don't think that bodes well for the chances of us actually coming back and physically reconvening a week from tomorrow, which will be October 11th, I believe, or October 12th. Anyways, if you follow the news cycles, which you should, that's the latest news as far as it impacts all of you and as far as it could conceivably impact me as well. Now, as I was saying, I received your tests, which almost all of you were good enough to send to me in compliance with the very explicit instructions that I gave to you on the test document itself. And what I want to do is I want to spend some time going over some of the more significant concerns that I saw as being systemic to many of what you guys submitted to me. That's not to say that all these tests were created equal. Some of you did very well. Some of you did not so well. And if you remember back to my original forecast of how this test was going to go, this was, I think I made this prediction about 3.5 weeks ago in class, and I said something to the effect that the distribution of the grades was going to be separated by a substantial margin. And what you were going to see was that there was a concentration of scores in the upper 10th percentile, right, in the 90 to 100% range, right? There was a concentration of scores there. And then there was going to be another concentration of scores in the F or the D range, right? That was what I projected. And I projected that based on my experience, which at this point is fairly extensive, having taught this class many times before. And the reason I was saying that 3 weeks ago was not so that I can come back 3 weeks from that point and say to all of you, haha, look at me, I was right, and go on about how clairvoyant and prescient I was in anticipating this. That wasn't the point. The reason I said that was because I wanted to allow for the possibility of all of you taking measures to ensure that that particular pattern did not, in fact, repeat itself. So I was hoping that you would take what I was saying seriously enough to take this exam seriously enough to ensure that you didn't actually fail the test or achieve an unsatisfactory level of academic performance. Now, it's invariably the case that some people may strive to do well and they don't, just because they don't think that they have the aptitude for it, or because they were not doing something that they should have been doing, or for other various reasons. Now, I don't know what the case is for each and every one of you individually. Okay. What I can say though is that you have to ask yourself a series of questions before you come to me and either assert or insinuate that your deficiency on this test was a product or a function of my inability to articulate these concepts in a sufficiently lucid and coherent and meaningful and intelligible way. I hope none of you think that. I believe that I spent a considerable amount of time expounding upon the topics that were actually later presented in the context of the exam itself. I did everything that I know how to do and everything that I really realistically can do under the circumstances, and provided you with as much information and advance notice as I possibly could. Now, that being said, some of you may want to re-examine your approach to this class, and we may be using the YouTube method of instruction for the indeterminable future. I don't know whether or not that's true. I don't know how long this is going to last. None of us does. But it bears mentioning, again, what I just said a minute ago, which is that things are regressing. Okay, it's one step forward, two steps back, at least for the Upper Peninsula, in terms of the epidemiology up there. Now, that doesn't strike me as very encouraging news, and I don't think that that bodes well for the likelihood of us going back to a physical class. This is something that none of us can control for. This is something that I have no discretion and control over. There's nothing I can do about it. And the college is doing the best that they can do, and they're responding to what they believe to be the best advice at this particular time. So what I would say is that I believe that this particular mode of instruction is more favorable to those who are aspiring to achieve success on the test. And I think I already said this before, but I'll say it again just for the sake of repeating it because it's important. What you can do with this particular mode of instruction is you can go back and you can review information, right? So you have a record, okay? There's a record that exists. You can go back and you can review that record. And you can likewise take as much, not quite as much time, but you have much greater liberty in terms of the taking of the test, as opposed to coming into a physical class and you have certain strictures, right? You have the environmental strictures, you have the time strictures. Some people don't work well with those constraints. Other people don't care. So I'm saying this to try to encourage you, for those of you who were discouraged by the results of your test. But understand that this is not really determinative of your success in the class overall. This is one test. This is our first test. The first test is always going to be the worst because you have no idea what's going on. Now, I can't say that without feeling somewhat disingenuous to the facts as they are, because I think I find it hard to believe that anybody came to me and said, you know, Jeff, I really had no idea what I was doing or what you were talking about in these questions. I would be disbelieving of that if you came to me and you said that. Precisely because what was in the test was material that we had really elucidated very thoroughly in the context of our classroom discussions. My monologue, right? Discussions, I use that word with great liberty. And furthermore, it was on the study guide. Okay, so I don't know what recourse you could have to appeal to the argument that I didn't know what was going on, other than to say that, well, that's your own lack of diligence, I would submit. Now, as to what to do about the test. Well, I guess before I get into that, I should tell you how the test went. For the first test, okay, this is your guys' first test, and as I say, generally what I see is an incremental improvement over the course of the term. The second test is marginally better than the first test in terms of the cumulative performance. The third test is marginally or sometimes more than marginally better than the second test, and so forth. And so your starting point is this test, right? And the average, the starting point numerically, the average for this test for the group, for the 9 of you that actually submitted a test to me, was an 82%. 82% average. Now that's a B minus. Now that's a very good average because the average, if you were to take all the averages of all the scores and all the grades across all the various disciplines at Go-the-Beck or at Michigan Tech or at Finlandia or wherever you wanted to take, you'd find that they come down to around 74, 75%, right? That's the average, if you will. That's the median, okay? So for you guys to pull off that 82% on the first test is good. It's not great, right? It's not fabulous, but it's pretty good. And I would say it was so good that it actually rather impressed me. And I don't want to mean to therefore imply that my expectations for this group were so substantially low that I was absolutely astounded when you did anything better than C. No, but ordinarily it is the case, and this is more so true of larger groups, and the statistics are a bit skewed because you guys are only a sample of 9 people, so that's difficult to really to do anything with statistically. But for the first test, that's a very good result. Now, I think that several things contributed to that. I think the fact that you guys had the opportunity to mull these questions over for the period of 6 or 7 days, or however long you actually had the test for, I don't know, it was a long time. And that was certainly conducive to your success because you could put more thought and time and consideration into formulating your answers. The fact that you had a study guide, the fact that we went through this, the fact that we had a YouTube video that referred to all this, I think all these things were instrumental in enabling you to achieve a degree of success. But I also sincerely, genuinely believe, and I'll say it for the record, that I think much of your success was predicated on preparation and studiousness and hard work and diligence and all the things that you should have been doing up until this point in the semester. Which, well, before I get to my second point, I should just finish where the grades were on this. Okay, going back to what I was saying a little while ago about the grade distribution, right? Now, if I had a dry erase board, which I still don't have, as you can see, but if I had a dry erase board, I would be drawing an image on this dry erase board, and it would look something like this. All right, so here's the graph, right? Here's the y-axis of the graph, right, and then here's the x-axis. Okay, the y-axis is let me think about this. The y-axis is the number of tests, right? Number of people, okay, in a particular concentration. The x-axis is the scores, right? So y-axis is here, x-axis is going this way, right? So scores are down here, F, D, C, B, A, okay? So the curve, if you were to plot this data along a curve, right, it would look something like this, right? It would go like this, right? There'd be a big curve, it'd be a substantial hump down in the D range, right, near the F range, and then you'd see a valley, okay, it would go down precipitously, and then there'd be another hump, right, up by the A range, okay, the 10th, 15th percentile range, which is to say that not many of you who took this test actually did anywhere near the average, right? There was a pretty substantial dichotomy between those who did very well and those who did not so well. So the way the scores turned out, there were 5 A's. So that means that over 50% of the people that took this test, because there were 9 of you who took the test, right? I don't know, 58% of you earned an A, somewhere within the A range, right? So that could be a 90%, that could be a 98%, that could be a 99%, somewhere within that range, from 90 to 100. 5 of you earned within the A range. Most of those were mid-level A's, actually, which is very good. All right, that's very encouraging for me as an instructor to see that. That suggests that you were paying attention and that you took this test seriously, and that you have assimilated yourself to the intellectual tempo of this particular course. There were no B's at all. There was 1 C. There were 2 D's, and unfortunately, one of our comrades failed this test. Now, what to do if you were dissatisfied with your performance? Well, what should be what's the determinative factor in terms of whether or not you should be satisfied with your performance? That's a subjective question. It's like saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? I don't know. I would say I don't think this is a particularly hard test. Of course, I don't always say that, but I usually say that. I think that this test was fairly easy under the circumstances because you guys had so much time and you had so much advance notice and you had the YouTube videos that you go back to and refer to. And I actually, as luck would have it, I graded this test more leniently than I will grade subsequent tests. So I will increase the rigorousness of my assessment when I grade your tests going forward. And the reason I do that is because I want to create an environment which is conducive to the development of analytical writing skills, which are absolutely indispensable to success in this class as well as in academic classes in general, and I would say in life more generally as well. So you really have to learn how to engage with these subjects in a way that is meaningful and in a way that discusses them point for point in a very systematic manner. And so I'll get into this here in a minute, but I want to spend considerable time alleviating any ambiguity that some of you may still have, any lingering consternation as to why I got this D or why I got this C or why I got this F. There should be no question as to why you received the grade that you did, right? And understand, you didn't. I should rephrase that. You didn't receive a grade. You earned a grade. Okay. Those of you who earned enough earned, or those of you who earned an A earned an A. You worked hard for that A. Those of you who earned a D earned that D. Right? Your work was commensurate to the grade that you received, which is to say that you didn't do as much work as the people who earned the A did. And that's not to denigrate or insult you personally. That's just to say that that's the way it ought to be. Right? This is a pure meritocratic system, whereby your performance, your performance on the test, and indeed the work that you put into that test, determines precisely and exclusively the outcome that you will receive in terms of the grade. So if you aspire to improve your grade, if you aspire to improve your academic performance in this class, then I strongly recommend that you take these tests very seriously. Now, the questions you need to ask yourself, right? And this does not, so for 5 of those people who are listening to this, you are exempted from the admonishment that I'm about to give here, because this doesn't apply to you. All right, you've already figured it out. You know you're ahead of the game. You're ahead of the curve, literally. And you don't need any advice from me beyond what I wrote on your tests. And by the way, each and every one of you would have received very thorough feedback on the test. It takes me roughly half an hour per test to grade these. Okay, so I spent 5 hours, upwards of 5.5 hours, just on this particular class. I think that's right. So there were 9 of you. Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. I think that's accurate. Something like that. Around 5.5, 6 hours. Right. Not that that's any small consolation to you if you didn't do as well as you'd wanted to, but just know that I take the grading process very seriously, and I hope that it shows. And I furthermore would say that if you haven't read the constructive criticism that I provided you with on the test itself, there's a lot of red font, not red ink, but red font that I expended on your respective tests, some more so than others. But I would strongly recommend that you do take the time to actually go over that and to review what it was I wrote, because much of that is going to provide you with very valuable insights in terms of how to improve upon whatever deficiencies were endemic to your performance the first time around. And understand, don't take this personal, okay? I mean, part of being a student and part of being an educated person in general is to learn to dissociate yourself from things that aren't meant to be taken personally. This is strictly business, okay? I'm doing my job, okay? My job is to be as objective and dispassionate and as reasonable and fair and impartial as I can be in adjudicating your grade on these tests. And as I told some of you will know this because you've been with me before, generally when I grade tests, this is not the case for online exams because they just don't lend themselves to this kind of process, but generally for physical tests, for physical actual tests, I don't even look at your guys' names when I grade the test. I don't look at people's names. Until after I've tabulated, of course, at a certain point in time, I'm gonna have to look at your name, to see who got this particular score. But when I begin, when I begin my analysis, I don't identify the person whose test I'm grading. Now, I don't do that because I think that if I fail to do that, I would otherwise my grading would somehow be undermined by some kind of subjective prejudice or special dispensation or special considerations that I would give to people that I like or don't like. That's not what I was concerned about. I do that so as to ensure that nobody can insinuate or even imply that I'm somehow beholden to some subjective preference when it comes to grading you guys. All right. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that. But what I do want to say, just very briefly, is if you are dissatisfied with your performance on this test, you have to ask yourself a series of questions. Okay. And the questions, the analysis begins with the first question, which is to ask yourself, have I been attending this class consistently? Okay. Have I been attending this class consistently? And by consistently, I mean most of the time. Okay. Are you there often? Or are you a sporadic attender of this class? Most of you, to your credit, for those of you who are consistent about attending, most of you actually are there most of the time, and that's a good thing. Okay, I don't know that if that says more about your willingness to get up early or your willingness to get the good grade. I don't know what it says about you, but it says something good, right? That you obviously you're sufficiently motivated to do what is required of you at the very basic level. Okay, that's question number one. Now, if the answer to that is yes, yes, I do consistently attend your class, Jeff, right? And you're one of those people who's dissatisfied with your performance on this test, then you go to the next question, all right? So, question number two, all right? Yes, you attend class regularly. While you're in class, are you attentive to what is being said? Are you actually engaging analytically and cognitively and intellectually with what I'm saying? Okay? Are you thinking about what is being said? All right? Or are you asleep? Or are you on your phone? Or are you distracted in some other way? Okay? So that's the second question, right? And if the answer to that is, well, yeah, I'm there in class consistently. I'm paying attention, and I'm aware of what's going on. Okay, and you're still dissatisfied with your performance. Then the next question is, do I take notes? Do I take notes comprehensively? Do I take good notes? Am I sufficiently attentive so that there's a connection between the notes that I take and what is actually being said by this guy when he's giving his lectures? And if the answer to that is yes, okay, right? So yes, you do attend class regularly. Yes, you are attentive. Yes, you do take notes, right? And you're still dissatisfied with your performance, right? Oh, and by the way, I should say if the answer to any of these questions is no, all right, or if it's maybe or I don't know, well, then that I would submit to you is the reason as to why you didn't do as well as you would otherwise hope to do, okay? So I'm not trying to absolve myself of any culpability for any inadequate performance on any of your behalfs. I'm just trying to say that to identify the rational cause of what may be the underlying reason as to why you didn't do as well as you had hoped, right? It does require this rather systematic analysis and asking these various questions. So question number 4, I guess this is question number attending class regularly, being attentive, taking note. Question number 4 is, did you actually engage with the review session that I conducted? Okay, now the review session for purposes of this class was the YouTube video that I posted a couple of weeks ago, or 10 days ago, whatever it was. But that's another dispositive question. Now, if you did not virtually attend that review session, and if you did not take good notes while doing so, then that may very well be the reason as to why you didn't do as well as you had hoped. Right? So all of these questions are important. Now, I would say the final question, and this is probably one of the most important questions, is assuming you did all those other things, right? Assuming that the answer to all those 4 preceding questions is yes, right? Yes, I attended. Yes, I'm aware of what's going on. Yes, I'm taking notes, and yes, I attended your review session, virtually speaking, through YouTube. Right? Yes, you did all those things, and yes, you are still dissatisfied with your grade, right? Well, then I would ask you the question, well, if there was some ambiguity or some uncertainty or some confusion or consternation as to what exactly these questions entailed, did you come to me? Did you come to me via phone? Did you call me? Or did you email me? Or last and indeed least, did you try to text me? Right? Did you do any one of those things? Did you try to reach out to me and solicit my insights and my expertise as they bear on offering you some kind of clarification on some ambiguity that you previously had? Did you do that? Right? And if the answer is no, and I think for those of you who, I mean, I know this for a fact because I haven't talked to anybody. None of you has bothered to reach out to me. I mean, some of you had been generous and concerned enough to say, hey, Jeff, how's it going down there in Detroit? Are you still alive and well? And I said, yeah. But notwithstanding that, none of you actually reached out to me and said, hey, Jeff, I'm not really sure about this whole mandate of heaven thing. Okay, could you explain the difference between primary and secondary sources? What's this business about topical versus thematic? None of you guys asked for any clarification on any of that. Okay, now if you don't ask the question, I have to presuppose that you know the answer, because if you're not asking the questions of me, if you're not asking me any questions for clarification, then I have no reason to suspect that you don't know what you're talking about, or you don't know what I'm talking about when I'm asking these questions. Okay, that is the fair assumption that I need to have, and that's my starting point. So until such time as you come to me and say, Jeff, I need help with this, that, or the other thing, again, help me help you. Okay, I guess that would be my point. Help me help you, right? And after you've gone through this rather rigorous analysis and you've asked the sequence of questions that I just adumbrated there for you, and you still, at the end of all this, you're still discontented and dissatisfied with your performance, and you still don't understand why you earned the score that you earned, whether that was a C or a D or an F, right? You still don't understand why, okay, after I've gone through and I've enumerated these various questions and I told you to ask this of yourself, right? Then come to me, okay? Then and only then you can come to me, right? Or if you're unclear as to what I just said, okay, which I think that was pretty clear. I mean, I was fairly explicit about this, right? But then come to me, okay? Don't preempt this and just immediately point the finger at me and say, Jeff, I think you're a horrible teacher, and I think that you need to do a better job of explaining things. If you didn't ask yourself those questions, right, and you haven't come to me as a product of that analysis, then I'm gonna say to you, I'm gonna ask you the question right to your face, very very bluntly. Did you do these things, right? If the answer is no in any one instance, then I'm going to say, well, that's probably the reason as to why you got the grade that you thought you didn't deserve, but you got anyways because you, in fact, that's the grade that you earned. So that's what I would say about that. Now, I don't feel as though I need to go over the test. I actually have the test here with me. I don't have any notes on this. This is just a blank template here. And I was thinking to myself whether or not would it really be a valuable use of our limited time for me to delve into a thorough elucidation of the various topics that are endemic to this particular test. Would that be necessary? Would that be valuable? Would that be significant? Would that be a meaningful expenditure of time and intellectual resources? I really don't think it is. I guess I'll just look at this real briefly, and I'm going to go over this very, very briefly. All right. And some of you may think this is redundant and superfluous. And for those of you who got an A, right, again, you should have been tuned out already. Okay. But this is, I promise I'll finish this up in the next 5 or 6 minutes because I'm going into a half an hour now. I don't want to take up much more time on the test. But this is the first test, and that's why I spend much more time on this than I will for subsequent tests. Right. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about tests from here on out. Right. So this is the time for those who did not get an A, because I would assume everybody who got an A is at least satisfied with their grade. I would hope that you are. You should be satisfied with an A, even if it was a 90%, right? Not a 96%. It was 90%. You should be satisfied with that, right? Right out of the gate, your first rodeo, okay? This is an essay test. I know it was take home, and I know you had the YouTube lectures, and I know you had all the notes and open book and all the open source, but still, an A is an A, and nothing can take away from that. So, for those of you who got an A, don't be concerned, all right? And I would further speculate that if you've done well enough thus far to earn yourself an A on the first test, which by the way is going to be the most challenging because you haven't assimilated yourself to my method of asking questions yet, then I don't want to say it's a foregone conclusion that therefore all subsequent tests you'll do at least as good as you did in the first test, but that's a fairly good presumption to make, okay? That if you did well on the first test, if you got an A on the first test, then you probably won't do any less well on subsequent tests, assuming you continue to do the same sorts of things that you've been doing up until now. So for those of you who got an A, keep doing whatever it is you've been doing, all right? For those of you who did not get an A, or who otherwise, for those of you who did not get an A, this is not addressed to the A people at all. And I should say, and are not satisfied with the grade that you earned, right? Listen to me, okay? Listen to me right now, okay? Because I'm speaking to you when I go through these questions. First of all, well, number one, I'll just go through sequentially. There were no problems on number one. Number one was a very easy question. It was meant to be easy, and I guess the first point I would make about this is in the directions, this is in the instructions. I was very explicit about this, but one of the things that you all have to understand is that my level of analysis, the extent to which I rigorously evaluate and scrutinize what you wrote, is a function of how many points happen to be assigned to a particular question. So the more points are assigned to a particular question, the more substantial and comprehensive and extensive in terms of breadth, in terms of scope, in terms of detail, in terms of miscellaneous discussions, right? The more expansive your answer needs to be. So for a 4-point question, I'm only expecting you to tell me basically what a primary source is, what a secondary source is, and then give me some examples of each, right? And if you can do that in 4 sentences, good, more power to you. That's great. I'm happy, you're happy, okay? We all go home happy. But for an 8 or a 10 or a 12-point question, or especially a 16-point question, as the latter two were, I'm expecting, reasonably expecting, a very extensive analysis. And I don't mean you need to write reams and reams of dissertation level response. I'm not unreasonable in my expectations. However, this is an essay test, okay? And I think I prefaced all this by actually telling you guys what I recommend the length in response. Yes, and I said 4 to 8 sentences for short answer. And I said anywhere between 6 to 12 sentences in response to the long answer. So there you have it, right? I mean, unequivocally, in very explicit terms. I told you what the standards were, and some of you decided to ignore that or disregard that or just go ahead and write a couple of sentences and think that that was going to be satisfactory for purposes of answering the questions, when in actuality it wasn't, because I told you before that it wouldn't be. And so you can't therefore come back after the fact and say, throw your hands up. I didn't know I was supposed to have to give you two paragraphs in response. You can't say that, because I told you in the instructions, in the directions, what I was expecting. Okay, I enumerated them very, very concisely. Okay, number two, thematic or topical approach versus a chronological approach. Thematic and topical is the same thing, all right? They're two words that have the same meaning, all right? Some of you guys did not apparently know that. And chronological just means it's a line moving forward in time sequentially, and you have these dates on that line, and things happen in a sequence, right? Number three, what practical advantages did the development of a rudimentary system of writing confer upon civilization which employed it? Some of you missed some of the more subtle points that were associated with this question. I was looking for somebody to tell me explicitly, well, it's about contracts, it's about commerce, it's about being able to say that you have something that's written down, and that confers a degree of certitude and certainty to it. Whereas if you just tell people that, yeah, me and Methuselah over there, we got this contract for him to build me a new pigsty out back in my house out back in Babylon over there. Well, you can repudiate that contract unilaterally, and so too can Methuselah. Okay, and the same is true of government orders that are promulgated by a king or a priest or whoever that percolate down. If those orders are codified, if those orders are transcribed on a piece of paper or a stone tablet or whatever it is, papyrus, well, that confers a degree of certainty to that, right? They're unambiguous. Okay, there's no room for interpretation. So it ensures that you have a higher level of efficiency, and efficiency is conducive to less doubt. Right? It reduces doubt with respects to commerce and trade. It makes commerce and trade more effective because people know what they're talking about with respects to contracts. It makes government more effective because the government is able to disseminate orders more effectively, and those orders are not going to be lost in translation. Other things. I mean, there's many things you could say. How did the geographical and topographical factors help facilitate the development of civilization in ancient Egypt? So there are three basic sub points to this, three constituent points that you had to make here. The first was the insulating function or the prophylactic function of the Sahara Desert. The desert surrounds Egypt. Egypt is in a desert. It always has been, always will be, presumably. And that desert keeps people out. It's very difficult to invade Egypt because it's very inhospitable. It's difficult to cross the desert. It's unless you find an oasis, it's difficult to maintain your lines of supply, right? So it insulates, it protects Egypt from outside invasions. The second point that you would make was the proximity of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea, okay? And the fact that Egypt was so close to the Mediterranean Sea was supportive or facilitative or conducive to the development of large-scale commercial trade routes. And trade, as we know, is very important for the government. It's very important for being able to develop enough of a strong enough economy to be able to support and sustain your people and support and sustain your army, which is necessary to go out there and conquer new lands and maintain your empire. So that's important. And thirdly, and I would think most importantly, and indeed the most nuanced of these points, which is one that some of you just kind of missed, and some of you sort of said something about this, but the relationship that the people had to the river, right? The Nile River. And the Nile River was volatile, it was tempestuous, it was wild. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, right? It's a good thing because it forces the people of ancient Egypt to work together collaboratively and cooperatively and to organize themselves according to some kind of social hierarchy which conduces to greater efficiency. They can work more efficiently, they can delegate responsibilities, they can organize themselves, they can undertake great civil and civilizational projects such as building levee systems and irrigating their crops and building temples and building pyramids eventually, and doing all the sorts of things that the Egyptians became known for, right? Well, the impetus, the incipient inspiration for that social cohesion and organization was the fact that the Nile River was a tempestuous, wild, raging river. I feel like this is deja vu, okay? I feel like what I'm doing here right now is, I hope it's not a waste of time, but I feel like it's a slightly redundant exercise. It's an exercise that may strike some of you as being slightly redundant, even more than slightly redundant, because I think I just talked about this stuff 10 days ago when I put out that review session for the test. So, which brings me back to the point that I want to make here, which is to say that I really do think that all of you had everything that you needed to answer these questions competently. Okay, maybe not to the level which would guarantee that you received an A, but competently. If you really paid attention to what has been going on thus far. I know I've said all this stuff before, and oftentimes on multiple occasions. Okay, number 5, discuss the ways in which Pharaoh Akhenaten sought to change the Egyptian religious practices, likewise expound upon why such changes may have been pragmatic and advantageous for the power of the Pharaoh in relation to other elements in Egyptian society. What I needed to see here, okay, and I really needed to see this, was you said something to the effect of, number one, it was conducive to greater social cohesion and solidarity because it reduced factionalism or reduced sectarian disagreements and contention between people disagreeing about this god or that god. And then number two, uh, Akhenaten becomes the sole, exclusive, unilateral interpreter of the will of the gods himself. He doesn't rely. He doesn't have to rely upon the priests anymore, and so he cuts out the middleman. Okay, and then you could have elaborated to various degrees on either of those particular points, but those are the 2 points that I was looking for. Describe the mandate of heaven and the ways in which a ruler could either cultivate and sustain it or how he could lose it. What was the irony? Was the paradox inherent in all of this? Well, the paradox was that the Zhao invented this because they thought it was politically expedient to do so, but they hadn't necessarily anticipated that this was going to be used against them to undermine their rule eventually. Right? So that's kind of ironic because the thing that destroys them is the thing that they created for themselves to justify their taking over the previous dynasty and giving them some kind of divine sanction, legitimacy, and conferring upon them, vindicating their overthrow of the previous regime. Well, they should have known that if they can use that to overthrow the previous regime, who's to say that the next regime can't use it to overthrow them? Hence the irony. What is the mandate of heaven? Well, look, guys, I think this is a very intuitive thing, all right? I mean, I was very explicit about this just last week, okay? Well, the week before last week, 10 days ago when we actually saw each other last. And I said that to cultivate the mandate of heaven, you go out there and you rule well, and you are a benevolent and benign ruler, and you treat people justly and equitably, and you rule in accordance with how the gods think you ought to behave. Okay, if you're a good ruler, if you're fair and just and equitable and judicious in your practices, well, then the gods will support and sanction and protect, validate your rule. Okay, and the people won't be able to overthrow you because they'd be striking a hand against the gods in addition to a hand against the kings. However, if you're capricious and you're arbitrary and you're narcissistic and you're diabolical and you're invidious and insidious and you're like a Saddam Hussein in ancient China and you like torturing people arbitrarily, well, then the gods are going to rescind their approval. They're no longer going to validate your rule because you're ruling in a way that is inconsistent with what the people would think to be as being good and being noble and being consistent with the highest ethos of what a ruler ought to aspire to do. And so you lose the mandate of heaven. Describe the feudal system as it was devised and implemented by the Zhao dynasty. It wasn't just a matter of, well, you got the king, then you got the higher nobles, then you got the middle nobles, then you got the lower nobles, then you got everybody else. Yes, that's part of it, okay? But the more important aspect of it was, first of all, why was there a feudal system? Well, because China was big and all that entailed, et cetera, et cetera. And second of all, what was the act that consummated the actual exchange of reciprocal obligations between the feudal lord and his subordinates, right? The patron, okay, and the client that comes as a supplicant before him. What was that act? Well, it was called laying prostrate before him, right? I did this in class. I sullied myself by laying on that table there in the chemistry class. I looked like an idiot while doing so. Hopefully that was memorable for you, and hopefully you were remembering, you were having nostalgic flashbacks of that when you were answering that question. But those were all things that you got to say. The long answer. The most problematic component of this test was the last page of the test. Okay, so assuming you can fit both long answers on one page, this is where I saw the most conspicuous point loss. All right, this was kind of across the board, regardless of what grade you received. Now, I'm not going to take too much more time because I'm going on 40 minutes here, and I could spend all day talking about this, but I don't want to. So, I'll just say this: the way you should look at an essay, a long answer question, and this is also likewise true of a short answer question, but it's more true of a long answer question. This is your opportunity to demonstrate to me, to my satisfaction, and understand that the bar is pretty high here, okay? I have a pretty high bar in terms of what my expectations are because, after all, this is a take-home test, There's no reason why you guys shouldn't be giving me all the answers that you have available, assuming you've been paying attention all along, which is what I have to assume. So there's no reason for me to give you any special dispensation to presuppose that, oh, you don't actually know the answer to the question. There's no reason for me to expect that. So this is your opportunity to convince me that you really know what you're talking about. Now you have to work at convincing me, right? You can't just say, oh, the hunter-gatherers, they were dangerous, right? It was a dangerous situation for them because they were getting chased around by lions and such. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Okay. I'm looking for a full, comprehensive analysis. And I want you to do a comparison between the hunter-gatherers and the agrarian types, right? And I want you to go through and elaborate on the various different conditions that were endemic to those particular social constructs. And so that's an illustration of what I'm expecting. But the broader point, the principle here is that on a long answer question, again, especially the essays, the long answer essays, they're all long answers, but the really long answer essay questions, what I really want is I want you to tell me as much as you can possibly think of that obviously is germane and relevant to the topic that's being asked by the question. Now you can introduce stuff that is superfluous. Okay, you can introduce and you can talk about anything under the sun. You're just not going to get any points for it, right? I mean, I won't deduct points if you start talking about Saddam Hussein when you're answering this question about I don't know what this last question here. Well, the hunter-gatherers and the agrarian peoples, or better yet, Hammurabi's Code. Okay, if you start telling me about Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, I'm going to wonder why you're talking about those people, but I'm not going to deduct any points. So it's in your interest to throw everything into your answer that you can possibly throw in. Okay. Now, of course, at a certain point in time, I'm going to get annoyed if that's what you're doing consistently, because it suggests to my mind that you actually don't know what you're talking about. I probably won't fail you out of spite for doing that, but that will get very tedious for me, and I might decide to not give you as many points eventually. But I think for the long answer questions, it definitely behooves you to say as much as you possibly can say. And some of the stuff you may consider some of the stuff to be superfluous or irrelevant or just not necessary to actually get all the points, but don't assume that, okay? And the other point that I would make about all of this is all of you have to presuppose, when you're answering these questions, presuppose that I am somebody who's completely ignorant of history. I don't know anything about history, okay? I do know something about history, as hopefully you know by now, right? But assume that I don't, right? Assume that you're writing this for your younger brother or your little sister, right? Or your Uncle Fester or Uncle Bob or whoever it is, right? That's never picked up a history book in his life, never graduated from history class in his life, right? Assume that you're writing for that person, right? Somebody who doesn't know anything about these things, and so you have to set everything up, okay? You have to set the basic parameters up and explain everything in a minutiae of detail. Now that doesn't mean this is going to take 10 hours for you to write this test. Honestly, if you're very well prepared for this and you've been attending class, you've been listening, you've been paying attention, you've been taking notes, you've been doing the review, right? You've been reading the text as well. Actually, no, that's even not necessary. I don't even go into that because you did not need to read the text to be successful in this exam. That was something that was entirely unnecessary. Now, if you did that, good for you. But I would say the other point about this is don't give me answers that derive exclusively from the book, because I'm less inclined to give you points. The whole purpose of this undertaking is for you to demonstrate to my satisfaction that you have learned enough through the lectures, that you've assimilated yourself to all the information that I've put out there, right, to the point that you can give that back to me. You can recapitulate that stuff. Not verbatim as I said it, right? I don't want you giving it back to me in my own words. I will not give you credit if you do that, right? If you just recycle what I said, point for point, word for word, ad nauseum, don't do that, okay? I won't be offended, but you're not going to get any points if you do that, right? You gotta tell me in your own words what you think. Well, not what you think about these things, because it's not subjective, but explain these things in your own words in a way that makes sense to you and hopefully will make sense to me, okay? That's what you need to do. And if you're not doing that, and if you're not doing it comprehensively and expansively and extensively and bringing in everything that you can think of, well, you're probably not doing enough to get all the points. It's as easy as that. And if you're not doing all that, well, there's the reason as to why you didn't do as satisfactorily as you would aspire to do. So, drawing this to a close, okay, because I'm coming up on 45 minutes here, and I do want to talk a little bit about the lecture here eventually. If you are still dissatisfied with your performance, don't go run off and talk a bunch of trash about me behind my back, okay? I mean, you can do that. It's your prerogative. I personally wouldn't do that. I think that's unbecoming. I think that's ignominious. I think that's very shady and unscrupulous. Don't do that. That's shadiness, okay? No, if you seriously still have a problem, okay, with the grade that you earned, right? Because I'm not going to say that I don't give anybody a grade, right? I serve a computational function. I just add points up. And of course, I do a little bit more than that, but I'm very objective, and I got a very strict analytical metric that I use to evaluate the viability of your responses. So if you're still uncertain as to why you received the grade that you did in fact earn, then please call me. Okay, I think calling me and talking to me over the phone is probably going to be the best way to clarify this. If you absolutely must email me, then so be it. But I prefer to talk to you. Okay. Finally, let's finish talking about ancient ancient China, and the last slide that I was on is entitled "Demise of the Han." Okay, the Han Dynasty, right? The Han. Remember Han Solo? So we were talking about the Han. We were talking about the Zhao before the Han, and then the Han came along. And we were talking about the government and the ministers, and they had 3 chief ministers, and then they had 9 subordinate ministers, and these guys were associated with the household function of the emperor, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got to talking about. Oh no, I didn't get. I did not get to talking about this. The final point about the Han is how it all fell apart. Okay. So this kind of goes back to a point that I made when I initially introduced this subject of ancient China. Think about the size of ancient China. Think about the problems that are endemic or inherent to the geographical quality of ancient China being as big as it is. Right? China, modern day China, ancient China, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. And the problems that the Han had. Okay, so think about the size, number one, right? But also think about how the issue of the size would be exact, or the problems associated with the problems that are a product of the size, the largeness, the grandeur of ancient China, how those problems would be exacerbated if, in fact, the government is no longer running as efficiently as it otherwise would. So, the Han did not do what previous dynasties did, or they didn't do it as effectively as previous dynasties. What they did not do, they failed to incorporate a highly effective, very efficient meritocratic bureaucracy, whereby your advancement through the various echelons of the government within the Han system was predicated upon how good you were at doing a particular job, right? So your job function was evaluated by some civil service examination, and you took this exam, and then the exam was meant to ascertain how adept you were at your particular job within the Han government or within the preceding regimes in China, right? The Han didn't necessarily throw it all out, right? But they said, we're not too concerned about meritocracy. It's less of a concern. So they spent less time, less energy cultivating and sustaining and maintaining this process of vetting their candidates for higher echelon governmental functions. Now, what that invariably led to was nepotism supplanting and replacing and taking over in the place of a meritocracy, right? So you have a system whereby people get ahead by virtue of who they know, not by virtue of what they know. And that's a bad situation, because then you've got people who aren't necessarily qualified to be doing what they're doing, because the only reason they occupy that position is because they know Chang over there, right? P.F. Chang is the main man, right? He's the boss man. We all know he makes a really good, Szechuan chicken or whatever you can get from him. P.F. Chang is the minister. He's the minister in charge of the bureaucracy, and he hooked Yin Yang over here up. He hooked Yin Yang up over here, right? And Yin Yang is in this position exclusively because he's got this personal fraternal association with P.F. Chang, hypothetically speaking, right? Well, if that's the system upon which your government is predicated, your organizing principle, then you're going to see a depreciation in terms of the quality of your government bureaucracy. And what are the things that are associated with government bureaucracy? Well, processing information, disseminating orders, regulating the economy. How about this? Taxation. The proper collection of taxes and ensuring that you are able to extract that wealth from the population in a way that is just and is commensurate with the value of the property that you're taxing, right? Well, the taxation process becomes undermined by virtue of the fact that the people who are responsible for superintending on behalf of the government are no longer really qualified to be doing that job, because they're not a product of a meritocratic system. They're a product of a nepotistic system, right? A system whereby it's how you get ahead by virtue of who you know, not by virtue of what you know. Now that's a problem, okay? And so as you begin to lose tax revenue, as the Han government begins to lose tax revenue, which itself is a function of the ineptitude of many of their bureaucrats, because these people are no longer a product of the exclusively meritocratic system, you begin to lose tax revenue because your tax collection processes aren't as efficient as they otherwise would be, and you begin to therefore also not be able to support and sustain all the facets of government that you previously were able to support and sustain. So you have to cut back on certain governmental functions. Okay, one of the governmental functions you cut back on is education. And when you cut back on education, what does that necessarily lead to invariably? I think it leads to the inescapable conclusion that the less educated your people are going to be, the less competent they are at doing things that actually require an education, whether it's a technical education, whether it's a scientific education, whether it's an empirical or mathematical education, the less adept you are at doing things that require some sort of academic training, some kind of intellectual conditioning, okay? And what does that do? Well, it's a feedback loop, right? Because that leads back into the situation that was the problem in the first place. It exacerbates the fact that you don't have qualified people because now you have a system that doesn't select for the most qualified candidate. It's not a meritocratic system anymore. It's a nepotistic system, right? And now you have people who are not very well educated who are entering that system, right? So whereas before you had a good educational system, it was robust, it was efficacious, it was working properly, right? And the people who were aspiring to be bureaucrats for the Han government were properly educated before they actually entered the meritocratic system, right? So they had an education, so they knew what they were doing. They were trained to do what they were doing, and they had the proper disciplines that were inculcated in them to make them more proficient at their job. Well, now you have education which begins to deteriorate as a consequence of this lack of this depreciation in tax revenues. What else do you see? Well, the Han government begins to relegate more and more, concentrate more and more of their limited resources to the periphery of their empire. Okay, and this is going back. This is circling full back to the point that I originally made when I introduced the topic of ancient China. If you remember that 2 weeks ago, which is to say that the reason why, if you're the Han government and you're the central government, you're the king, you're the emperor, that you want to spend your scarce financial resources, because again you don't have as much money anymore because the tax revenue is being limited, because your system is no longer as effective as it once was, because you have less educated people working for you, and because the bureaucracy is mired by corruption and nepotism because it's not a meritocratic system anymore, right? So now you have less resources, less financial resources at your disposal. Well, what do you do with those financial resources? Well, you allocate them as prudentially and as competently and pragmatically as you can. But what you have to do is you have to spend more money in the provinces, in the peripheral provinces, right? So if this was a visual conceptual diagram that I was drawing, right? Here's the center of the Han Empire, right? Right here, my heart, okay? Heart's on this side, all right? This is my left, okay? Right, here's the center, okay? Well, you're more concerned with the peripheries, okay? The peripheries, right? The way out here, right? This is the periphery, right? This is as far away from the center as you can get while still being under the auspices of the Han Empire, right? Why are the periphery, why are the boundary zones, the border areas, the borderlands, if you will, right? Why is that a concern for the Han? Well, because that's the most likely place we're going to face an invasion. So you concentrate the scarce financial resources, invest those resources in those peripheral areas, invest them in infrastructure, walls, defensive perimeters, military forces, okay? But what's happening? What's happening? Well, this goes back to a point that I was making with respects to other preceding dynasties. What's happening is that the governors of these peripheral areas that are far away from the central headquarters of the central capital, the Zhao, the governors of these various constituent provinces that are along the periphery, they become more and more powerful. As they become more and more powerful, they achieve greater personal discretion, greater personal control and autonomy over their own affairs within their particular jurisdiction. And as a consequence of that, the relationship between the provinces, the precincts, the peripheral precincts on the boundaries becomes more and more attenuated, okay? Right? More and more strained, all right? It's less concrete, it's less solidified than it was previously, right? Because these guys, they're getting more power, more influence, more control, more autonomy, more soldiers, more discretion. And indeed, the more they operate independently, the less they have this sense of fidelity and loyalty and fealty and obedience and deference to the center. Remember, we're operating along feudal principles, going back to the feudal system. All these various regional governors, they were appointed by virtue of rendering under Caesar, right? Giving praise and honoring and adulation and respect and deference to the king of the Zhao, right? But none of that really matters anymore, because you look at this practically, okay? And pragmatically speaking, for the sake of the Zhao, the Zhao cannot maintain its defensive capabilities unless it gives these provincial governors nearly unlimited discretion, nearly unlimited control to do whatever they need to do to ensure that they're defending the borders from various incursions and invasions. And so what eventually happens is the governors come together, the governors of these various constituent provinces along the periphery of the boundary zones of the Han Empire, and they say to the king, they say, look, we've already got a high measure of independence. We already have a high level of personal discretion and control over our own affairs, right? We are independent kingdoms. We are sovereign kingdoms unto ourselves, all but in name. Now, why don't you just go ahead and ratify that and make it official? Because if you don't, we will turn against you. And there will be civil war, and there will be chaos, and there will be disorder, and it will all fall apart because we won't be working together towards some cohesive, coherent, unilateral objective. And the Han king realized that he had no choice. He realized that these governors, as they said, as they suggested, right, they really are, for all intents and purposes, functionally independent because they've got the resources, they've got the troops, they've got the prerogative to defend their people, and the people are loyal to the provincial governors because that's who's providing them with protection and sanctuary. And so that this is the process, okay, which results in the demise of the Han, as I titled it in this particular slide. The inexorable, actually I should say more precipitous, because this is a rather quick thing. This doesn't take very long for this to happen. So understand the reasons, the systemic causes of that deterioration in social cohesion, in the stability of the state, in the capacity of the state to actually control its various subjects. Understand what the contributing reasons were that went into that. Okay, I don't really have very much more to talk about with respect to ancient China, and I think that may have very well been the last slide on the topic of China. And it's not a particularly interesting subject anyways. I want to get to ancient Rome. I want to get to ancient Greece, which is going to be coming up after ancient Persia. But we're going to turn now to Persia. And this is a subject that is, I think, more interesting than ancient China just because it's a more dramatic history. And this is slideshow, I think, number 4. Okay, I don't remember what the sequence actually is, but it's a slideshow after the one that deals with China. And I think that's it's either number 3 or number 4. But the second slide looks like this. It says ancient Persia, okay? And it's got a picture. Well, I'll explain that picture here in a minute. But all right. So let's talk a little bit about the sources that we have for ancient Persia. Now, there's a problem with the sources. There's only 2 sources, two viable sources. I'm not going to say reliable because reliability is a different issue than viability, but viable sources, meaningful sources, all right? Sources that we can actually use, that have some sort of historical and analytical utility to them. The first source is called the Nabonidus Chronicle. Okay, I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It doesn't really matter, but it's on the slide. Okay, the Nabonidus Chronicle. Now, this is a good source for the following reason. It's a good source because it is a high measure of reliability, a high degree of historical and factual veracity, a high level of authenticity can be ascribed to the Nabonidus Chronicle. You can say that whoever transcribed whatever it was they were writing 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, whatever they were writing, we can cross-reference stuff that is found in this chronicle with other materials whose authenticity and quality and veracity we know is very reliable. We know those other materials are reliable. We can cross-reference these things, and we can sort of check what is going on in the Nabonidus Chronicle and with reference to other documents that were produced around this particular time, other primary sources, and we can say, well, they're all talking about this particular event, and they all seem to be saying roughly the same sort of thing, right? The narrative is fairly consistent in terms of its overall structure. And that's a way to verify, to authenticate, if you will, to legitimate a particular source, right? Remember, this goes back to one of the very first points I made in one of the very first class days that we had, which is to say that sources in history are like witnesses in law, Okay, there are rules that govern evidence in law. There are rules that govern sources in history. Okay, the rules of evidence they call them, right? It goes to what is admissible, what is inadmissible. You can't admit hearsay, you can't admit conjecture and speculation. And you heard this from rumor mill and et cetera, et cetera. You have to meet a certain standard or a burden of proof, et cetera. Right? These are the things that qualify evidence that's adduced in the context of a proceeding at law before a judge. Right? Well, we have the same sort of process, analytical process, which ascertains what evidence, what historical evidence is actually reliable and valuable and has some analytical utility for us as historians. So we ask ourselves the question: is there a way to authenticate these sources? And for most of these sources, unfortunately, at this particular time, the answer is no. But in some cases, like the Nabonius Chronicle, this thing that I refer to as the Nabonius Chronicle, I may be mispronouncing this, but for that, for instance, we do have a way of authenticating that, right? Because we look at other sources that were contemporaneous with that thing when it was produced 2,500 years ago, and we say, well, these sources are all talking about the same thing, and they're basically saying the same stuff about this particular person or this particular event, right? So it's unlikely, given that there are no profound discrepancies in terms of the narrative structure of these various accounts, it's unlikely that this, because this Nabonius Chronicle was right about this one thing, or it was saying, it was reporting information that was consistent with other sources about this one thing. We know the reliability of those other sources. We know that they come from a highly reliable witness. That therefore we can deduce that what the Nabonius Chronicle says, not just about that one thing where there's this confirmatory reliance upon some other sources talking about the same thing, we could say, well, it's pretty much it's fairly reliable across the board. It's consistently, generically, generally reliable. Now, the problem with the Chronicle is that it's fragmented. It's only a partial record. Okay, it's fragmented in the sense that we have pieces of the puzzle, but the pieces aren't together. They don't come together in a way that actually is a way for us to see the totality of the picture. You can't see the forest from the trees. Okay, you can see an individual tree here, you can see an individual tree over there, but you can't ascertain where you are in relation to the overall forest, so to speak. Okay, and that's the problem. So it's incomplete, right? And its incompleteness, I would say, supersedes or undermines, eclipses, overrides the utility that it has as a source. Just because it has a great deal of veracity and authenticity and it's factually correct doesn't necessarily mean it's a valuable source. Now, the other source that we have, all right, the other primary source, and these are primary sources. These are the only sources that really matter when it comes to ancient history. Secondary sources are open to all sorts of interpretive nuance, okay, and that's why we can't really rely upon secondary sources, because they come so far after the fact. And the more ancient the history, the more attenuated the secondary source becomes, right? Because most of the secondary sources that are written about this stuff wasn't really produced until the mid 18th century, right? When a guy by the name of Edward Gibbon, very famous English historian, he wrote about the ancient Roman Empire, and he wrote all about the lives of the Caesars, sort of in the style of Polybus. Okay, so he was a Roman historian, kind of like Pliny, many of the other primary sources that we use for Rome. But Edward Gibbon came along in the 18th century in England, and he started writing about ancient Rome, and that began a trend. Okay, whereby historians of the industrial era began to focus more intensively on the history of early ancient history, right? Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Persia, ancient Egypt, ancient etc. Right? But the problem is that their perspectives, these secondary sources that came along 2,000 years after this historical stuff happened, right? The problem with that is that a lot of that is going to be modulated or adulterated or undermined. The objectivity of it is going to be undermined and modulated and adulterated by, contaminated by the subjective considerations that those individual interpreters of historical information are going to have. So Edward Gibbon was a Eurocentric historian, for instance, right? He was very focused on the exclusively benevolent and benign things that Europe contributed to the advancement of civilization as a whole. Now, if that's your approach to understanding the past, you're going to be fairly flawed in your analytical capacity, or you're going to be fairly subjective, and I would say, therefore, not entirely impartial. So, therefore, as a result of all that I just said, okay, we have to rely upon primary sources as being the least contaminated, the least infected by some sort of post hoc bias, some kind of bias that was a product of subsequent history. Now, that's not to say necessarily that the primary sources, whether we're dealing with ancient Persia or ancient Greece or ancient Babylon or whatever, that all these primary sources are going to be just 100%, 100% pure, factual, accurate truth. Not at all. And this leads me to the other primary source, which is Herodotus. Now, this name should be familiar to you, not because I expect you to know who that is because you watch the History Channel or you watch PBS or whatever, or listen to NPR, but you should know who that is because I talked about this guy, okay? He is the quote unquote father of history. It's a problem with Herodotus. If you remember, when I first brought up this subject, I had a slide that had a screenshot from a movie that I like, one of the many movies that I like, and one of the many movies that I like to talk about. And it was a screenshot from the movie Alexander, Colin Farrell, Angelina Jolie, and I was using this screenshot as an illustration of the extent to which Herodotus liked to embellish and sensationalize the history that he was reporting. Because, like the movie that screenshot came from, the movie Alexander, that was directed by Oliver Stone, um, Oliver Stone, much like Martin Scorsese, much like Ridley Scott, especially, is known for doing this, he likes to tell a dramatic story. Well, Herodotus was, if you'll permit the analogy, was the Ridley Scott of the ancient world. Okay, they didn't have movies, they didn't have television series, they had books. Okay, the books of the ancient world were the movies of the contemporary modern 21st century culture, right? And if you've ever seen a Ridley Scott movie, he was the director and the producer of Gladiator. He was the director and producer of, I believe, Aliens, the original Aliens, going all the way back to Sigourney Weaver, for those of you who are old enough to remember this. He was the director and producer of, I think it was Avatar. Maybe that was James Cameron. But I know he did a lot of historical movies. One of which was Gladiator. The best of which was Gladiator. The other was called Kingdom of Heaven. Was about the Crusades. It was less good, but still pretty good. Anyways, the problem with Ridley Scott is that he likes to sensationalize. So much so that the underlying history is sometimes obscured by the dramatic effect. So they refer to this in film and in literature as dramatic license. Okay, an author of historical fiction or historical nonfiction, indeed, can take dramatic license when he's interpreting certain events, and he can embellish, add certain embellishments here and there, make it more interesting, jazz it up a little bit. Well, the problem with Herodotus's writings is that so much of what he says is so difficult to actually square with the facts as we believe them to have happened, right? And the other problem is that much of what he's written doesn't really allow for us to hold it up against some other source and cross-reference it for veracity and for reliability. Okay, so veracity is just to say that this thing is authentic, right? This thing is a genuine reporting of whatever transpired that this person was recording in particular, right? That's authenticity, okay? And now that's fairly. I think that's actually the same as. Well, I guess that's slightly different than reliability. But they're both similar and related concepts, right? But we want a high level of reliability. We also want a high level of authenticity or accuracy, I suppose you could say, right? We don't want people just making things up as they go along. Now that's the problem with Herodotus. Now when you read Herodotus, I have a well-worn copy of Herodotus. And I've read it many times. I don't have it with me, unfortunately. I left it up in Calumet. But when you read Herodotus, it's good reading. It's interesting. It's fun reading. But history can't always be fun, and that's the problem with Herodotus. Is he likes to make up. What he does is he puts words in the mouths of people that are allegedly saying these words, but he couldn't conceivably have been there to have witnessed what all these people allegedly had said. And so he's inventing dialogue, is what he does. He invents a lot of dialogue, and he invents a lot of stories. And the history of Herodotus is quasi mythical in its accounting of how things actually happen. And you're going to see what I mean by this in a minute. But when he starts talking about the wars that eventuate between Greece and Persia, he goes all the way back to sort of prehistorical times, mythical, legendary times, and he goes all the way back to the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which, for those of you who are familiar with the works of Homer, and by the way, I really shouldn't say the works of Homer. It was an oral, it was a story. It was an oral tradition. It was passed down through the ages verbally until eventually somebody had the good idea to write it down. But it was a legend, right? The story of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, and the story of Achilles, and the story of Helen of Troy, who was the most beautiful woman in the world, the face to launch 1,000 ships, and the war between Greece and the Trojans in the city of Troy. Well, that story, we know that there may be some historical truth to that, maybe some. but probably not very much at all. Okay, most of that is just a bunch of nonsense. It's talking about the gods and the demigods, and Achilles was part god, and Hector was part god, and the gods are coming down and they're intervening in the affairs of men. And unless any of you actually really do truly believe in the gods of Mount Olympus, maybe there are some followers and fans of the Olympian gods out there. I don't want to offend any polytheists that might worship and venerate Zeus and Nike and Apollo and the rest of the gods, but I'll take that. I'll take that chance and say that most of you probably don't venerate those gods. But the problem with that history is that it presupposes that there's all sorts of mythical and legendary things happening, and there are all kinds of mythical creatures and all other sorts of nonsense that doesn't really belong in a really serious intellectual undertaking in approaching the study of history. So the problem with Herodotus is that he's very sensational. He's like the Ridley Scott of ancient historians. He likes to add a bunch of stuff that is not necessarily helpful in understanding what the history of the period was. It can't possibly be accurate, right? Because he couldn't possibly have been in all the places that he's telling us about. When you read his history, okay, when you read, it's just called the histories, right? When you read the histories that Herodotus wrote, right, he tells us all about the ecology of ancient Egypt. And he tells us what kind of plants grow there. And he tells us what kind of animals live in North Africa. And he tells us what language the people speak if you go far enough east into the lands of Mesopotamia. And he tells us what the trees are like that grow up in Scythia, which is modern day Uzbekistan, right? He tells us all these. Now, Herodotus could not have known all this. He could have known some of it, right? But he couldn't have possibly known all of it, right? He heard this secondhand. But he's one of these guys that takes secondhand stories and then he turns them around and he tries to make it seem as though he was personally experiencing all this because he's a bit of a narcissist. Now, maybe some of you have known these kinds of people, and I've known them myself. They tend to be very interesting, but they tend to be very unreliable individuals. So reliability is the problem with Herodotus, okay? It's reliability. It's not lack of substance, because he's got a lot of material there. He says a lot, right? The comprehensiveness and the scope of his study is very extensive. It's very expansive. He talks about a lot of things. He talks about everything under the sun. More than just history. And that's the interesting thing about Herodotus, is he's more than just a historian. He's sort of an anthropologist, because he talks about culture. He talks about the different traditions that these people have. What do they do? What are their beliefs? What are their gods? What do their gods think about them? What do they think about the gods, etc.? That was the first time that anybody had come along in history and thought that, maybe it's a good idea to write all this stuff down, okay? Because people might not remember it otherwise. As an academic exercise, right? Not just some cheap piece of monarchical propaganda that some king made up so as to ingratiate his subjects to him, right? This is the first time that a man came along, or anybody came along, and thought to himself, well, maybe I better record this stuff for posterity's sake, so that we can remember what happened, so we don't forget these mistakes of the past, and we don't repeat them. Okay, I don't know if that's what Herodotus was saying to himself when he actually wrote this stuff down, but I like to believe that, because it makes it seem like a more worthwhile undertaking. Okay, so those are the sources that we have to deal with. And the vast majority of what I'm going to tell you here is coming from Herodotus. And you're going to pick up on the Herodotean ethos here very, very quickly, because you're going to see that the structure of Herodotus's historical narrative is more like the structure of a movie or a storybook. If you were to open up a storybook with lots of pictures, right? Like a coloring book, okay, where you take your crayon and you color some guy's face in or something, right? That's kind of what Herodotus is, right? It's like the coloring book version of history. It's fun, it's gaudy, it's ostentatious, it's looks pretty exciting, but there's not really much to learn there, because a lot of it's just fantastical and fanciful and phantasmagorical. And that's great, because it makes for great storytelling, okay? But is it really authentic? Is it really true to fact? Probably not. What's the other problem? Herodotus was a Greek. He came from Greece. He came from the eastern part of Greece, which at that time was actually located in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. But that's a superfluous fact, because he was Greek in terms of his language, in terms of his culture, in terms of the gods that he believed, his ancestors, everything else, right? He was Greek, okay? And who is he writing about? He's writing about the Persians. What do we know? Well, maybe you don't know this, but you're going to learn a lot about this. And if you don't know it already, you're going to get ready for it, because you're going to hear it. What do we know about Greece and Persia? We know that they had a very contentious relationship for many, many, many generations, going back since time immemorial. In fact, Herodotus actually makes the point that the dispute between Greece as one monolithic cultural entity that speaks a particular language, worships certain gods, has certain traditions, practices, beliefs, etc. Right, and then Persia as another monolithic entity that has its own heritage, has its own practices, has its own language, has its own gods, etc., etc. Right, the contention, the dispute that arose between them, originated incipiently with the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, all the way back in prehistory. And mind you, this is Herodotus telling the story of how the conflict arose between Greece and Persia, how it originated, right? Mind you, that the story of the Trojan War, the mythical war between Troy and Greece, is just that. It is a myth. It is a legend. Okay, that's like saying that everything that happened in the Old Testament actually is literally the history of the world. Now, some people may believe that. Okay, you're entitled to that belief. I would hope that you'd be able to support and substantiate that empirically through evidence, right? And if you can't do that, then I'm probably going to be unconvinced. But you believe in whatever you want. Okay, I'm not going to denigrate those beliefs. However, right, this particular belief, okay, the belief that there was this great war between the Trojans and the Greeks, way back when in prehistory, thousands of years before before Herodotus even came along, right? This is impossible to authenticate any of this. Okay, it's impossible to know this, and it would be more likely, infinitely more probable, even at that time, 2,500 years ago, even living in a time of ignorance, relative ignorance, much more probable to just say that the story about the wars between the Trojans and the Greeks was just a fantasy. Okay, but instead of dismissing it as fantasy, what Herodotus does is he incorporates that into his own historical narrative, and he makes that part of the history itself. That's a problem, okay? I don't start telling you guys about the history of the ancient world by beginning with, well, first there was Adam, and then there was Eve, okay? And she came out of she was one of Adam's ribs, okay? And then the story about the talking snake and the tree of evil and the forbidden fruit and this, that, and the other thing, right? And how they were coexisting with dinosaurs from the Paleolithic era, right? I don't that's not where we start, okay? Because that's prehistory, okay? That as far as I'm concerned, that's more theology than it is history, right? And as far as the Greeks and as far as any of us are concerned, what Herodotus is really doing is he's infusing myth slash legend with an authentic historical narrative, thereby de-authenticating that historical narrative in the process, because he's adding a bunch of junk that doesn't belong in there, which undermines the credibility of much of it. Now, it doesn't completely render it void and nullify all of it, but it nullifies a lot of it. Okay, so let's talk about the origins of ancient Persia. So before Persia came along, you had what was known as the Median Empire, or the Empire of the Medes, Medes, all right, the Medes. Median is probably spelled the same way as you'd spell median, the mathematical term, statistical term. You had the Medes, okay? Before you had, I'm sorry, after you had what am I talking about? Let me make sure I'm doing this properly, guys. And I apologize because there's many different people living in ancient Syria and Mesopotamia at this time, and I have to make sure I give you the proper sequence here. Oh, yes. Okay, so before the Persians, there were the Medes. Before the Medes, I better keep this. Before the Medes, there were the Assyrians. Now, the Medians, the Medes, whatever you want to call them, the Medes, the Medians, they overthrew the Assyrians, okay? And they had a series of kings, 7 or 8 kings. And the last king of the Medes, his name was Astyages. And his name is on the slide, I believe. I think his name is on the slide. If it's not, don't worry about it because I don't care about spelling, and you guys know that. The last king of the Medes, his name was Astyages. Now, Herodotus tells us that Astyages had a daughter, and his daughter had a son. So therefore, the grandson of this last king of the Medes, right? He had a daughter who had a son, and that makes the son his grandson. And Astyages used to have dreams about his daughter. And these dreams were rather unusual dreams. You could say they were even somewhat erotic dreams. They were the kind of dreams that Donald Trump probably has of his daughter Ivanka, right? If you actually listen to what Donald Trump used to say about Ivanka, that, oh well, if I wasn't her father, I'd actually, I'd like to take her out, and yeah, she's really hot, right? I don't know if that's what Astyages thought about his daughter, but his dreams are rather suggestive that maybe he did have that kind of abnormal, unnatural relationship with his daughter. One of the dreams that Astyages had about his daughter, according to Herodotus, and you'll pick up the Herodotian dramatic effect here in a minute here, was he had a dream that his daughter was standing in his bedroom. This is the king, the father, the daughter, right? Last king of the Medes. That his daughter was standing in the king's bedroom, and she was standing there naked. Okay, which is rather unusual. Okay, to be dreaming about your daughter in that way, standing in your intimate bedchamber naked, and that she began to experience this unusual growth that expanded out of her, well, let's just say her womb, okay? uh, that from her sprung forth this giant tree-like appendage. All right, it was like Jack and the Beanstalk. All right, you guys remember the story of Jack and the Beanstalk? And it's this giant, like the kid plants the seed, and then it grows into this magical, huge tree, and it's like this giant weed that goes all the way up to heaven. Well, imagine something like that, right? Sprouting out of between the legs of the daughter of Astyages, the last king of the Medes, right? This giant tree sprouts out, and it becomes larger and larger and larger, and soon it overtakes his entire bedroom in his dream, and then it bursts out of his bedroom, and it bursts through the palace walls, and the tree becomes so huge that it eclipses the sun, and it takes over the whole world, and the vines just come all over the place. They saturate everything. That was the dream that Astyages has. Now, Astyages is not an interpreter of metaphor, and he goes to his priests and his diviners and the people who are responsible for interceding on behalf of the gods, and he tells them about this unnatural and unusual dream. And he says, "Yeah, I had this dream. My daughter was there, standing in my room naked, and they're thinking to themselves, oh, you're a dirty old man. That's pretty degenerate of you." And he says, but yeah, I didn't do anything with her, right? Yeah, I was just standing there, or she was just standing there. I was sleeping in my bed, in my dream, and then this giant beanstalk comes sprouting out of her. Right? What is the significance of this? And his priests and his advisors and his learned counselors, they say, that is a sign from the gods, Astyages. That sign is a warning from the gods. And it is meant as a metaphor, as a symbolic, allegorical metaphor, to represent what will eventually become the invincible power of the spawn, the seed of your daughter, i.e., your grandson. Okay, that this dream is meant to foreshadow and to anticipate that this child is destined for greatness, that he will aspire to achieve such great things that his deeds will even eclipse your deeds, Astyages. Even though you're the great king of the Medes, and you've done some pretty great things, right? But you better be wary of this grandson, okay? And Astyages he's a megalomaniacal guy. He's interested in maintaining his power, as all men of power and responsibility and privilege are. And he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to conspire with his chief bodyguard, the head of his secret service, right? So they have this royal bodyguard. I don't know what they refer to him as, but the guy who's most responsible for protecting the life of the king. And Hippias is his name, okay, according to Herodotus. And these names, most of these names are probably just made up. Herodotus is making this stuff up as he goes along. And the king, so he's got this, the priest interpret this dream, and Astyages says, yeah, that's probably what it means, right? It's probably meant to foreshadow my doom, right? It's a prescient dream. It's prefiguring my doom. It's my demise. I'm going to be overthrown by my grandson. That's a terrible thing. So I better do something about this. So he calls in his chief bodyguard, and summons Hippias, this guy, and he says, Hippias, you've been a loyal servant of mine, and now I trust you with a mission and an assignment of such great significance and great importance that's going to require great discretion. I trust nobody else with this. Hippias says, what do you have for me, my lord? What is the mission you will have me do? Astyages says, I want you to go out and to kill my grandson, Cyrus, because I had this dream, and my daughter was standing butt naked in my bedroom. And Hippias says, I don't want to hear any more about this. That just sounds depraved. And Astyages says, no, you gotta listen to the rest of this, because you gotta wait for the punchline. It's getting more interesting. And so he says, and then this giant beanstalk spread out from between her legs, and it grew up and it took over the entire world. And that's meant to foreshadow that her son, my grandson, is going to take over the world, is going to overthrow me, and that's going to be the end of this. So go out there and do this dastardly deed, Harpagus, and you shall be richly rewarded for conspiring with me to murder my own grandson. So Harpagus goes back to his wife. He goes back to his home on the homestead, and he tells his wife. He confides in his wife what the king had commanded him to do. And the wife says, my women's intuition, right? It says, don't do this thing, okay? Don't go out there and kill Cyrus. Cyrus is destined for greatness. Don't interfere with the plan of the gods, okay? Because this she says, think about the dream, right? Think about the dream that came to Astyages. Why did he have this dream in the first place? Who put that dream into his mind? I mean, unless you presuppose that he's a dirty old man, he's got all kinds of perverted desires about his daughter. Maybe so. I don't know. Maybe he thinks about her like Ivanka. I don't know. Right? If you presuppose that, well, then you could say, well, that's what's in his mind, right? The subconscious is intruding itself into his mind when he goes to sleep. But the wife of Harpagus, the chief bodyguard of the king, says, my women's intuition tells me the gods implanted that dream in the mind of the king for a reason. And that was meant to foreshadow and anticipate that which is preordained. We cannot change the destiny because it is written. The gods have already written it. The gods are the authors of our destiny. We can do nothing. We men are but shadows and dust. Right? And his wife says, furthermore, okay, fine, you don't want to believe in the whole predestination thing. You don't want to believe that this dream was inculcated in the mind of Astyages by the gods themselves. Fine. All right, think about the practical implications of this. What's going to happen if you go out there and kill the grandson of Astyages, and Astyages is old. He's like older than Joe Biden, okay? And he looks as feeble as the guy does, right? He's ready to fall over and have a heart attack any day. And so the wife says, what's going to happen when you kill Astyages, the great king of the Medes? Who's going to take over? Well, he doesn't have a son. He's got this daughter. And do you think that this daughter is going to forget or forgive you for having been complicit in the murder of her own son, the son that was destined for greatness, destined by the gods for greatness? You think she's going to forget and forgive that? You don't need to be a mother to have that sort of intuition, she says to Harpagus, this conspirator with Astyages, who's about to commit this terrible dastardly deed, this crime. And Harpagus thinks about it, and he says, yeah, you know what, you're right. So what he does is, I'm qualifying all of this by prefacing it with the statement, according to Herodotus, okay? And whenever I say according to Herodotus, that means take this with the proverbial grain of salt, okay? What that means is that it may be made up, okay? We don't know, right? That's like saying, if everything you've ever learned about the history of Rome derives from having watched the movie Gladiator, I would say to you, you probably don't really know that much about Rome at all. You may know about this guy, General Maximus, and you may know about Marcus Aurelius, you may know about some other characters, you may know about... Most of those characters weren't actually real characters. They were composite characters. They were completely fictitious, farcical characters, right? So that's what I mean when I preface and qualify this by saying, well, according to Herodotus, this thing happened, right? So please pardon that qualifier as it comes up. Now, again, what allegedly happens next is that Harpagus goes out and he finds a shepherd and his wife. And it just so happens that the shepherd's wife had given birth to a stillborn. Okay, the child is born, but it's dead, right? It didn't have enough oxygen to the brain and it dies, right? And how convenient. Well, I got the stillborn here, and I was supposed to be commanded to go kill the grandson of the king. Yeah. Why don't we just do a little switcheroo here, right? And that's the plan, the scheme that Harpagus devises for himself. So he explains the situation. He says he doesn't tell the shepherd couple the royal origins of the young lad, by the way, whose name is Cyrus, I should say, the grandson that's being plotted against, that these guys are conspiring to kill. The grandson of Astyages, the son of his daughter, who he had this disgusting dream about. His name is Cyrus. And so Harpagus decides that he is going to bring Cyrus to this peasant, right? This farmer who's out there living with the sheep and the goats and tending the flock, and his wife. And therefore he can take the stillborn, their biological son, and present it back to his lord and master, the king Astyages, and claim, look at this, my lord, I suffocated the body, or I suffocated the child, I suffocated your grandson. Look at what I did. and claim to obviously misrepresent, misconstrue the facts, but hopefully persuade the king that this is what he actually did, and therefore get his just rewards. So he does that, and he persuades the shepherd and his wife to take this baby and to raise it as their own. Now this should be reminiscent for those of you who heard the story of, I think it was Moses actually, right? The reed basket. Remember this? Passover. Pharaoh declared that every firstborn son must be murdered because in vengeance for some sort of dispute between Egypt and the Israelites. This was going to be inflicted upon the people, and Moses, the family of Moses, somehow was prescient enough to anticipate this, and so they put him in the reed basket. He goes down the Nile River, and he's discovered by the handmaiden of Pharaoh's niece or his aunt or something. And then Moses is actually adopted into the royal family of Egypt, and he becomes an adopted brother of Ramses. Well, for those of you who know the story of the Exodus, you should know all this. But the reason I'm reminiscing on the story of Moses is because that sounds to me to be very similar to the narrative structure of this story with respect to Cyrus, right? Cyrus was, much like Moses, a very extraordinary individual, right? He had a noble pedigree, okay, right? And he was marked for death, either at birth or very soon after his birth, right? He was marked for death by the temporal powers of the land, right? The king that controlled the particular land, either Pharaoh in Egypt, the guy who came before Ramses, or in the case of Cyrus, he was marked for death by his own grandfather, Astyages. So I think there are some substantial parallels, and then of course the parallels continue as you follow the reed basket down the Nile River, okay, and then it's found by this compassionate and very concerned woman who adopts this baby and raises the baby as her own and brings it into the household of the king of ancient Egypt. And so I think there's a lot of cross-cultural borrowing that goes on here, and that's another point that I try to make throughout our conversations in history here, is to look at these otherwise very disparate and unique histories, and to look at the point where there's some parallels here, and to say to ourselves, ask ourselves the question: is it merely just this profound coincidence where these people tend to develop these stories, these mythical, quasi-mythical stories that are completely independent of each other, right? It's just a coincidence that they all particular civilizations go along the same trajectory, and they eventually end up developing these particular stories that sound a lot the same. Or is it more likely that, well, ancient Persia was a pretty big, expansive place, and it was at a certain point in time, it actually expanded all the way down to Egypt under the reign of Cambyses. Is it possible that maybe the story of the birth and the origin story, the Wolverine origin story of Cyrus, right? That story came traveling with the Persians down to Egypt. The Egyptians heard that story, and then the Israelis, who were maybe captive in Egypt at that time, maybe not, depending on whether or not you ascribe any veracity to Exodus. But the Israelis heard that story, and then they said, let's borrow that and incorporate that into our own prophecies and our own testimonials about the story of Moses. I think that that's a much more likely explanation than to say that these things are completely unrelated. They have no relationship whatsoever. That's too much. I'm sorry. That's stretching my my credulity. Okay, so going back to the story of Cyrus. So Appius comes back to the king. He comes back to the throne room and he says, "Look, my lord, I killed Cyrus. I killed your grandson. Give me gold and give me riches." And Astyages says, "Looks good. You've done good work, soldier. And I'm going to reward you for this work." However, Astyages was cleverer than he looked, and more clever than he was letting on, to allow for some deception here. And in fact, Astyages, because after all he is the grandson of the child who he had ordered to be murdered, the child he ordered a hit to be done on. He recognized that this was obviously not Cyrus, and he was enraged by this. And so Astyages, he decides to play along, and he's gonna. What do they say about revenge? It's a dish best served cold, right? So calculate your revenge, plan it strategically, so it has the maximum impactfulness on whoever it is you're gonna exact your retribution upon. So Astyages decides he's going to play along and he's going to act as, oh yeah, this looks like Cyrus, right? When in actuality he knows that it's not his grandson, right? And so he also therefore must know that Hippias is trying to perpetrate a fraud, right? That Hippias just brought back some random dead baby and is pretending that this is actually the grandson. Now, Astyages is enraged by this, right? But Astyages doesn't let on that he actually knows what's going on. So he says, Hippias, my good, loyal, trusted bodyguard, you have done such good work. I'm going to convene all my nobles and all my court in my great throne room, and we're going to have a huge banquet in celebration of you successfully conspiring with me to murder my grandson Cyrus, who would have otherwise overthrown me, according to this dream that I had. And we're gonna have this great lavish feast, and it's gonna be awesome. And let's go. Let's go get ready for the feast. And so they go, and the cooks prepare the various food and the various delicatessens that they're gonna indulge in. And they all sit down at the table, and Hippias sits down there, and Astyages is sitting down there, and Hippias the first entree that they serve is this. It's like a soup. It's like a stew, and they bring the soup, bring the canister of soup. They bring the bowl of soup over there to Hippias, and Hippias, he's pretty hungry. He's been out there trying to find a way how to deceive the king into believing that he murdered his grandson. So he worked up an appetite doing all that, conspiring with the shepherd out there. And he's hungry. So he starts eating this soup, sitting there at the king's table, and Astyages, the king, turns to his bodyguard, and he says, "Yeah, I like that soup there. Is it warm enough for you? Is there enough meat in there?" And Hippias says, "Yeah, this soup is amazing. This shit's better than Kentucky Fried Chicken. What is this? Is this chicken in here? What is this?" And Astyages kind of sits back like a boss, reclines in his chair like a boss, looks at Hippias, and he says, "You know what? That soup that you're eating right there, guess what? That's your son. Son, I had your son chopped up and prepared medium well and prepared in that soup. And I served him to you. And that's what you're eating. That's not Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's your own son. What do you think about that, punk?" And Hippias is obviously disgusted. I don't know. He probably throws up. He probably runs out. He's appalled. He realizes that he just engaged in cannibalism. Involuntary, I mean, unwittingly, but still, he ate his own son. So that's what happens when you betray a king of the ancient Medes. You have your son fed to you clandestinely without your knowledge, and then you sit there across the table from the king, and he gets to tell you that you're eating your own son when you thought this was some really good beef stew that you're eating. And so the story goes on to say that Cyrus is raised by this shepherd and his wife. Shepherd and his wife. What other similarities what other parallels can we draw? Well, this sounds like Joseph and Mary, doesn't it? Those of you who remember the story of Bethlehem, right? The virgin birth, Bethlehem, the first Christmas, okay, with the Magi, the three kings, etc. Joseph was a shepherd. Right? Mary was a peasant girl, much like the woman who raised Cyrus. And I think so. So the question becomes, why? What's the point of the story? Okay, why would Herodotus go through all this trouble to make up this very elaborate narrative, which is probably mostly fictionalized? What is he trying? What's the point he's trying to convey? Well, if you say that Cyrus ends up living this very robust, very Spartan life with these peasants, he's living with these peasants, he's growing up with them, it's meant to accentuate the fact that Cyrus was not corrupted by the trappings of power and the luxury and the ostentatious comfort that would otherwise have been afforded him if in fact he had grown up in the palace. He would have had private tutors. He would have had a dietitian, a personal chef, a personal trainer. Well, maybe not all that, but you know what I'm saying. He would have had the Kim Kardashian life. He would have had the baller life. And I think the point that Herodotus is trying to make, in a rather contrived way, admittedly, the point he's trying to make is that, look, this kid grew up in the hood, essentially, right? He came up in the streets, right? He's from the mean streets of Flint or Bay City or something, right? living out there with those peasants, out there with those rustics, because they're buggering their sheep when they get bored of their wives. I mean, all sorts of disgusting things are going on out there, right? He's living out there, he's shoveling shit in the backyard, he's living a tough life. Well, I think that that's meant to emphasize the point that Cyrus grew up properly. He was inculcated with the proper virtues and the proper values. He learned to respect the value of hard work, honesty, living the decent, honorable life, living the old school, old fashioned life of a farmer, right? I think that that's meant to accentuate the fact that this is a guy who was not corrupted by the appeal or the temptations of power, which oftentimes do in fact corrupt young princes, especially those who are subjected to these things at a very young age. And so that's when I examine the story, right, and I ask myself, right, what's the reasoning behind this? What's the rationale? Is there a rhyme and reasoning? Is there a method to the madness? Um, what is the reason as to why Herodotus devised the story in the way that he did? And I think that that's part of it. Okay, now there could be more to that, right? You could explore other facets of this, but I think that that's one of the elements. But it's important to remember also that this says a lot about the relationship that the Greeks had to Cyrus, their conceptualization, their understanding of who Cyrus was as a man. If they're making up this elaborate story to accentuate his virtues and the fact that he was raised in this very rustic lifestyle and therefore he was inculcated with the proper values and he grew up to be a good, honorable, decent, honest man who had respect for this kind of lifestyle, this kind of crude backwoods lifestyle. If that's the thing that the Greeks are saying about, I mean, they obviously mean this in a very complimentary manner, right? They're saying this not to denigrate Cyrus, but rather to extol him as being a man of great virtue, right? The fact that he's a product of both worlds, okay? He went from riches to rags and then back again to riches, right? If that's the way you want to look at it, okay? Because eventually, as the story goes on, so Cyrus spends his youth, his adolescence, his childhood with this peasant, this farmer, and his wife, the goat herder, or whatever you want to call him, the shepherd, and he grows up on the farm. And it's said that Cyrus was a very strong and very charismatic and very strapping young lad. But it was also said that from a very young age, he had a very commanding presence about him. And this is according to Herodotus, so you know what that means. It said that Cyrus used to play a game with the fellow peasant children that he grew up with. And it was kind of like King of the Hill. I don't know if you guys growing up in the UP ever played this game, but it's a game that you probably have to wear a helmet now to play because people are so concerned about kids doing stupid things. But it's a game where you get up on a little hill or something, and the other kids try to push you off, and they try to take over. Right? It's a competition of strength and agility. And they used to play that game. Cyrus used to play this game. So apparently the game King of the Hill is thousands of years old. And when they were playing this game, Herodotus said that Cyrus always was so charismatic, right? Was so affable, was so congenial, was so beloved of the children, even at a young age of 7 or 8 or 9 years old, however old, young lad, that the children would always elect him to be their leader, to make determinations as to which game they should play today. Well, today is it going to be hopscotch? Is it going to be tic-tac-toe? Is it going to be dice? It's going to be King of the Hill? It's going to be tag? It's going to be hide and seek? What game are we going to play, Osiris? Right? Which is to say, again, this is Herodotus's rather convoluted, contrived, supercilious way of getting to the point that he's making the case essentially through these fictional allegorical references that Cyrus was a very wise and prudent and judicious individual. If he was so wise and so insightful and so I don't know, precocious, right? He had wisdom beyond his years, right? Very mature for the fact that he was a young man. He was so precocious at that age. Imagine how much more wise he's going to be when he grows up and he becomes a full-grown man and he becomes learned. He goes out and reads philosophy and things. And so I think that that's the point that Herodotus is trying to make. So eventually, Herodotus says that Cyrus becomes a man. He reaches the age of manhood, 18, 19 years old, and he learns about the plot that was orchestrated against him by his own grandfather, Astyages. And Cyrus decides to go out and find Hippias. Remember, Hippias was the chief of the Secret Service, chief of the royal bodyguard of Astyages, the co-conspirator who planned to actually conspire and murder Cyrus in his crib way back when the story first began. And so Cyrus thinks to himself, I got to go find that guy. Okay, I got to go find my would-be murderer, who actually turned out to be my my savior because he had the good conscience and consideration to ensure that I ended up with this family that protected me and raised me right. I'm gonna go find him because I need an ally. And Cyrus is thinking to himself, who would be a better ally to me, Cyrus, in my attempt, in my scheme to overthrow Astyages, who, by the way, is still the king of the Medes. All right, Astyages is very old by now. Hippias is very old by now. Cyrus is a young man by now. This is 17, 18 years after the story began. All right, Cyrus is thinking to himself, who shall I find to be my conspirator, to be my co-conspirator in devising a plan, this master plan whereby we will recruit all the various people who have been subjugated and oppressed by the Medes, and we will organize this resistance, and we will inspire a revolution or rebellion, and we will overthrow Astyages. Who will be the most optimally suited person to be the most reliable and trustworthy lieutenant that I can rely upon, who I can confide all my various plans in, and who will go along with whatever I say? Right? Who is the person that I can find that will certainly maintain the confidence of my trust? Well, of course it's going to be Hippias. He's the guy whose own son was brutally murdered and then fed to him by Astyages. So of course he wants revenge, right? He wants to get back at that guy for murdering his son, okay, and then in due course feeding him his son, right? Um, so Cyrus and Hippias get together and they decide to organize the Persians, which, by the way, was one of the constituent ethnic groups that was being ruled over by the Medes. Okay, so there were many different ethnic groups ruled by the Medes: the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians. The Persians just happened to be one of them, and the Persians, much like all these other groups, were tired of being lorded over by this other group of people, the Medes. Right? They were tired of being oppressed. They were tired of being relegated to second-class citizenship status, and so Cyrus comes along, right? He reveals the fact that he's got this noble lineage. He reveals the fact that he's actually maybe not the rightful heir to the throne, but he's the rightful heir after his mother to the throne. He's got noble blood that courses through his veins, and nobility confers a certain measure of integrity and respectability upon a man, especially in the ancient world, because it was thought that nobles were descendants from the gods. Right? Whether you lived in ancient Persia, whether you lived in ancient Greece, whether you lived in ancient Egypt, it was believed by most people, because they were too stupid to know otherwise, to know any better, that most of the kings were descended from the gods, right? And so if you got Cyrus, who's descended from the gods, you also got Cyrus, who happens to have had the benefit of living in a very Spartan existence, having been raised on a farm by this goat herder, the shepherd, and his wife, right? Who has these very rustic values, who's able to therefore commiserate and identify and develop a rapport with the common people, right? But also has got the noble blood, right? So it gives him some legitimacy, right? It gives him some air of authority and respectability, which you otherwise wouldn't have, right? And he's got this very charismatic personality that inspires people to follow him wherever he goes. Even as a young boy, he was able to inspire the children to follow him and to follow his decrees in terms of what games they're going to play. So he's got this constellation of qualities that enable him to be very successful as an aspiring future leader. And guess what? As luck would have it, as the story is told by the rather devious and untruthful Herodotus, it said that Cyrus was able to organize the Persians in a upheaval, a great upheaval, a revolution of sorts, a rebellion against the Medes, overthrow the Medes, and at the last minute, in the final battle, this cataclysmic battle, and the Persians overwhelm the forces of the Medes, and they capture none other than Astyages, the would-be murderer of Cyrus himself when he was yet a young boy in his crib. And what does Cyrus do? What does he do? Does he take his revenge? Does he take his revenge? No, he doesn't. He spares Astyages. He shows him mercy. He says, "Grandfather, even though you plotted against me in the most despicable way possible, because you had this depraved and unnatural dream about your own daughter being naked in your bedroom, and all the sorts of things that flowed from that. Right? Even though you plotted and you schemed against me when I was but a mere child, and too young to understand the evil that was working against me, even though you planned and plotted against me, And even though now I'm a man who understands justice and retribution and vengeance and the way the world works, I will exercise self-restraint and I will restrain my hand, even though I have the power. I have the power, I have the right, justice is on my side, the people are on my side. This would be a righteous act of vengeance, a righteous act of retributive justice. If I were to strike you down, O grandfather, O former king of the Medes, O Astyages, if I were to strike you down right now, if I were to strike you dead and kill you, or have you cut up and eat you, or whatever I was going to do, right? I could do that and very easily justify that and say that was righteous, it was forthcoming, it was mandated by the gods, and he got what he deserved. Okay, Cyrus says I could do that, but I'm not going to, right? And I think that Herodotus was clever enough to understand that this is a story that would resonate with future readers, because the real lesson here is the nature of power. Power is not going around and killing people. Okay, this is actually sort of a line that I stole from Schindler's List. If for those of you who have actually seen Schindler's List, it's a movie that I've seen so many times I can quote it verbatim every single line. And Oskar Schindler, this guy who saves hundreds of thousands of Jews from extermination, he's having this conversation with SS Untersturmführer Amon Gurt, who's the commandant of Plaszow concentration camp in occupied Poland. And he says, Schindler's trying to convince him to stop being sadistic, to stop going around and just killing random people. And Schindler makes the point that true power is not killing people when you can, but rather sparing those people from death when you have every right to kill them, when you have every justification to kill someone, but not killing that person. That's power, because it demonstrates that you can do something contrary to the expectations that everybody has of you, that you can do that, right? And nobody can question that. That's the sign of true power. And I think that that's the point that Herodotus wants to make here, or that's the point, that's the interpretation or the spin that I take on it anyways, right? I mean, I'm sure you could have a different construal of it, but I'm going to say that the point he's trying to make is to show, number one, Cyrus is a man who obviously understands principles of justice, okay? And number two, he's fair. And number three, he's even more than fair, because he's lenient and he's gracious and he's merciful even in victory, when he has complete hegemonic power, when he has complete capacity, complete control over your life, your continuing existence. And he decides, even though he has every right to kill you, he doesn't. He restrains himself from doing so. And that shows mercy, it shows compassion, it shows restraint, self-restraint. Right? It shows a lot of things that go to the character of the man. All right, and I think that was the point that Herodotus was trying to demonstrate here with this very elaborate story. And I apologize that it took as long as it did, but if you actually read the pages of Herodotus, this is almost an entire chapter in his histories that is dedicated to just explaining the backstory of Cyrus. Right. So for me to get through this in just under an hour, I think is actually pretty damn good. Wrapping things up here. This again, for those of you who fast forwarded this and didn't pay attention earlier on, this lecture is meant to be viewed this Wednesday, okay, which takes us to October 7th, I believe. October 7th or the October 8th. I don't know which it is, but that's what this lecture is meant when this lecture is meant to be viewed. I talked about the test in the first 45 minutes. So for those of you who really don't know why you received the grade that you did, or think that it was not a just grade, right? Go back to the beginning of this video and listen to what I have to say. And if you still are confused and have consternation as to why you did as poorly as you did, please do avail yourself of me and contact me as quickly as you can. Finally, we are going to continue talking about Persia next time. I may be seeing you guys on Monday. I don't know. Only the gods know, right? But what I'm going to do if I don't see you on Monday, and actually maybe I'll do this even if I do, because I'm realizing just now actually that these videos have been a little bit on the long side. The last video was almost 2 hours. I think it was almost exactly 2 hours. This video is going to be like 5 minutes short of 2 hours. And what that is not doing is it's not taking into consideration the break that I ordinarily allow you guys to have. Okay. And it's furthermore, it hasn't been taken into consideration the fact that this class is actually only an hour and 53 minutes long, not 120 minutes long. I'm sorry. Yeah. No. What am I saying? uh, 60 plus 53 minutes, so whatever that is. It's an hour and 53 minutes, not 2 hours long. So what I'm saying is that I'm going to discount that extra time that I've been taking up thus far. I'm going to discount that from the next video that I make, if in fact I do make a next video, right? Unless we're actually back in class on Monday. But in either case, it's going to be a shorter lecture to compensate for the fact that I've droned on a little bit longer than probably any of you are really willing to listen to me. But for those of you who have tuned in this long and are still listening, I appreciate it. Thank you. Much respect. And be safe. Stay safe up there. Be healthy and stay away from people who look like they're sick with COVID. And I will hope to see you guys in 8 or 9 days' time. But we'll see. I expect not to because I can't reasonably conceive GCC or anybody else going back between now and then. Okay. Sayonara, guys. Have a great week.